The MCU is without a doubt the most complete and well-structured cinematic universe we've ever seen, but as a Marvel universe, or if you look at it as an adaptation of Earth 616 from the comics, it's definitely missing a few key aspects, mostly due to the fact that Disney and Marvel didn't own all the movie rights to all the characters, most specifically Spider-Man, the X-Men, and the Fantastic Four. The former, Spider-Man, they made a deal with Sony, so they did bring him into the universe, but if you look at the X-Men and the Fantastic Four, that's two very, very large parts of the Marvel universe that is completely missing from the MCU. In the next few years, because Disney did buy Fox, we will see a lot of that aspect of the universe. The Fantastic Four are getting a movie in 2024, the same year that Deadpool 3 with Ryan Reynolds and Hugh Jackman is coming out. We also saw in this year an alternate universe version of Professor X, Mr. Marvel, and Namor are mutants, and so on and so forth. But what if we're the other way around? What if the MCU was actually the XMcu, the X-Men Cinematic Universe, and featured the Marvel Universe without any of the characters that Disney owns, like the Avengers, and also Spider-Man would not be a part of it, so really just all the characters that Fox owned. But in this universe, Fox did a much better job at structuring their universe, structuring all their movies together, and bringing the X-Men and the Fantastic Four and all the other characters that they own into one universe. What would that look like? I'm mostly going to focus on movies that exist, or if that does fail, because that definitely would, because then it would just be a bunch of X-Men movies and that's really it. I will also use a lot of movies that were in development, like Gambit, for instance, which is going to be the counterpart to Iron Man, as Gambit is a movie that was in development hell for a really, really long time, and there isn't really a lot of characters in the X-Men who I think could have their own trilogies, because the X-Men is not really like the Avengers. It's not like a group of heroes who come together. It's like their default is to be together, so there aren't a lot of characters from the X-Men who can have their own trilogies, but I think Gambit is one of them. And the fact that he had a movie in development, it never saw the light of day, but he did have a movie in development at one point. So that is going to be the first movie in this universe, Gambit, starring Channing Tatum. I know it would have made a lot more sense to start with Wolverine, or at least that's probably what you expected. But looking at the MCU, the Iron Man movies die out really quickly, and the Thor and Captain America movies stay around a bit longer, and I think Wolverine's trilogy should bleed a bit into Phase 3 and not just the beginning of Phase 2. And Gambit only having 2 movies before the X-Men movie and then another one right after, I think that makes a lot more sense. The Incredible Hulk is the only one-off movie in the Infinity Saga that never gets a sequel, which gives us a good opportunity to put in another movie that was in development for a very long time, but it never got made. A movie about a villain, but we don't have to give this villain a trilogy, which is why it works really well for the Incredible Hulk. This would be X-Men Origins Magneto, a movie which was cancelled due to the poor reception of X-Men Origins Wolverine, and the story of Magneto's origin was repurposed for X-Men First Class. That's probably for the better, because X-Men First Class was a great movie and Magneto was maybe the best character in it. But in this universe, in this alternate universe where the XMcu is the main cinematic universe for Marvel, Magneto, I think, getting his own movie works really well, setting him up as the villain of the first X-Men movie. This definitely deviates from the MCU a bit, as the MCU didn't give any villains their own movie, but if any Marvel villain deserves a solo movie as his introduction, it definitely would be Magneto. And this movie wouldn't not set up any characters, any members of the X-Men. Professor X would be a part of it, but not as the main character. Instead, a secondary main character, or even a bit of an antagonist near the end. The counterpart to Iron Man 2 would be the sequel to the counterpart to Iron Man 1, so Gambit 2. This movie would introduce Rogue as the counterpart to Black Widow, the key difference being that she would end up being Gambit's main love interest, which was not the case for Iron Man and Black Widow in the slightest. This movie would also include Professor X, and it would basically confirm Professor X to be the counterpart to Nick Fury, the person who brings the team together. The difference here is that Professor X does end up being a member of the X-Men, not just the person who brings it together like Nick Fury, but that does give us the opportunity to have 7 members of the X-Men instead of just 6, as the X-Men is usually a bigger team than the Avengers. The counterpart to Thor would be X-Men Origins Wolverine, or at least it would be based off of that movie. I would call this movie Wolverine Weapon X or Wolverine Origins. and it would just be a better version of that movie. That also doesn't include Deadpool, and while it does include Cyclops, it's only a cameo like how Hawkeye debuted in Thor. So Hawkeye and Cyclops would end up being counterparts. So for the Captain America counterpart, I decided to go with a completely new franchise about a character who never actually appeared in any of the X-Men movies and was only ever referenced like once. This is a Scarlet Witch movie. Like I said, there are not a lot of X-Men who can hold up their own trilogies. Scarlet Witch has a lot of stories that they can take from the Avengers as well to make a very good trilogy. There's also the fact that Captain America Civil War's counterpart basically has to be the most influential movie out of any of the 9 movies in these 3 trilogies, and Scarlet Witch I think could definitely pull that off. This movie would also feature Quicksilver, but Quicksilver would basically be Bucky's counterpart, so he would die in this movie, or at least he would seem to have died. And then he would return in the sequel to Scarlet Witch, possibly as an antagonist, but in the X-Men movie itself, he would not appear. That brings us to the X-Men movie, which acts a lot more like a big crossover team-up between superheroes instead of how the X-Men typically work, which is a group of characters who are mostly just each other's main supporting cast and don't really have separate lives or separate franchises, with some clear exceptions like Wolverine. And with how the first phase has gone so far, the lineup for the X-Men would include Professor X, Gambit, Scarlet Witch, Wolverine, Rogue, Cyclops, and the newly introduced in this movie, Jean Grey. I wanted to have Jean Grey in the beginning just because she's going to have a very big, important role in this universe, and because Cyclops is in this. Cyclops and Jean Grey would be the youngest members of this team. They would be the teenagers, while Rogue, Wolverine, Scarlet Witch, Gambit, and Professor X are adults, for a bit of a different dynamic for this team. Especially compared to the Avengers. Magneto would be the main villain. You could also have some other members of the Brotherhood of Mutants in this as the main villain. So it would basically be a combination of X-Men First Class in terms of the recruitment of it all, and the first X-Men movie, which had Magneto and the Brotherhood of Mutants as the main villains. The counterpart to Iron Man 3 would obviously be Gambit 3, a movie that would focus mostly on the relationship between Rogue and Gambit, and also the aftermath from the X-Men movie. Then there's the counterpart to Thor: The Dark World, which is a sequel to Wolverine, which is The Wolverine, or at least it's based off of the Wolverine from 2013, which actually did come out the same year as Thor: The Dark World. You could say it's basically the exact same movie, with the sole exception, the sole difference being that there's no Jean Grey aspect to it all. Wolverine's trauma from killing Jean Grey and the fact that he loved her, none of that is a part of this in the slightest. Then the counterpart to Captain America: The Winter Soldier, which is Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, which features Elizabeth Olsen as Scarlet Witch and Evan Peters as Quicksilver. As Quicksilver he was thought to be dead, but then he's brought back somehow, and Magneto is also a part of it, as he's confirmed to be Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch's father. So then there's the Guardians of the Galaxy counterpart. This is the first time the MCU ventured away from the Avengers, and so in the X-Men cinematic universe, they would venture away from the X-Men to the Fantastic Four, which would basically be the same as the Fantastic movie, just way better. It would have the same cast, because it would come out a year before the real world Fantastic movie. But aside from the cast, everything would be different. It would obviously be a lot better. It would make the Fantastic Four just as beloved as the Guardians of the Galaxy are now, in a very, very funny and very, very enjoyable movie. So then there's Avengers Age of Ultron and its counterpart X-Men Age of Apocalypse, which is mostly based off of X-Men Apocalypse, but there are definitely clear differences. For instance, Storm, Beast, Iceman, and Angel would all join the X-Men here. Angel would basically be the counterpart to the MCU's Quicksilver, as he's introduced in this movie and quickly turns into one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and then dies. So it's basically a reverse of Quicksilver, who starts out as a villain and then becomes a hero and then dies. Here, he starts out as a hero, then becomes a villain, and then dies. But I think it could be better than Quicksilver, as he's forced into becoming a villain, and then he breaks through that to sacrifice his life for somebody else. I think that could be a lot better, as Quicksilver's death in Age of Ultron was kind of awful. But I think that Apocalypse could have definitely been the Thanos counterpart to this universe, as he is just as powerful. But looking at, like, What If, for instance, it proves that Ultron could have 100% been just as powerful, if not more powerful, than Thanos. So the equivalent to Age of Ultron's main villain doesn't necessarily need to be less powerful than the counterpart to Thanos. So I think it just works really well as a counterpart to Age of Ultron. One thing that happens at the end of X-Men Apocalypse is that Jean Grey unleashes her Phoenix Force powers for the first time. That could be the first setup for the big Infinity War Endgame finale of this universe, as I'll confirm it here, the saga as a whole would be called the Dark Phoenix Saga, and Jean Grey's powers and her backstory would be focused on a lot in all the X-Men movies. That is something that all these videos of me restructuring universes does lack. Like, none of these universes have the setup that the Infinity Stones added, where we see an Infinity Stone in Captain America, the First Avenger, and Thor the Dark World, Guardians of the Galaxy, Age of Ultron. And that sets up the Infinity War. There aren't really any counterparts to that in any of these videos. So this universe could just be setting up Jean Grey as the Phoenix, and it would probably have to start here. You can mention that she's like the most powerful mutant ever in the first X-Men movie, or maybe even in her first appearance, which could be before that. But this movie would be the first time we see the Phoenix Force a bit, and that leads into the X-Men Dark Phoenix movie, which would be the counterpart to Avengers Infinity War, which we'll get to in a couple minutes. The next movie is Ant-Man, which would be the second non-X-Men related movie in this universe, as Ant-Man doesn't really become a part of the Avengers until Avengers Endgame. So this movie would be Daredevil, the only other side of the Marvel Universe that Fox owned at least at one point, aside from X-Men and the Fantastic Four, with the rights reverting back to Marvel in 2012, a couple of years before the Netflix show came out. In this XMcu dominated universe, the rights never reverted back to Marvel, and Fox released the Charlie Cox-led Daredevil movie instead of TV show in 2015, the same year that the Daredevil TV show did come out. Civil War is the reason I switched Captain America with Scarlet Witch, because she can have an entire movie about her that also doubles as an X-Men level crossover event movie that changes the universe going forward. This would be Scarlet Witch: The House of M, which is a story in the comics where Wanda loses control of her powers and kills a bunch of members of the Avengers by mistake, then rewrites reality to make humans the minority who are discriminated against instead of mutants, then rewrites reality again to erase mutation as a whole or almost completely, which is where the famous line, "No more mutants," comes from. The movie would definitely have to be different from the story in the comics, as the Avengers aren't a part of it, so she kills members of the X-Men instead of Avengers, and in the end, she doesn't erase mutation completely, as then the universe wouldn't really have anything to have movies based off of it, but it would definitely change the universe a lot going forward. How? Maybe you could split up the X-Men, maybe actually it does kill a bunch of members. I'm not really sure. It's more so the story itself that I wanted to include in this universe. Looking at all the movies that Fox had in development at some point that never got made into a movie, the Kitty Pryde Shadowcat movie stood out really well as a movie that would fit well into the structure of this universe due to her importance in the final movie. The final movie, which is going to be a counterpart to Endgame, will have time travel like Endgame, and the only movie in the X-Men universe that had time travel, not including Deadpool 2, is X-Men Days of Future Past, where the way they time traveled was using Kitty Pryde's powers. They changed it a bit so that she can't only phase through space, she could also phase through time, moving somebody's consciousness into their past self. This would change it up a bit from that. There's at one point in the comics she got powered up by something called the Black Vortex, giving her the ability to phase through dimensions, which would also make this movie visually similar to its MCU counterpart, Doctor Strange, while also setting Kitty up as one of the more powerful and important members of the X-Men, and the one that will bring them into the time travel dimension like the quantum realm in the last movie. Then there's Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 and its counterpart Fantastic Four: Rise of the Silver Surfer, a better version of that movie, but also with the cast from Fantastic. Now, the second Guardians movie had a celestial god who's arguably more powerful than Thanos as the main villain, so having the second Fantastic Four movie be Rise of the Silver Surfer with Galactus as the main villain doesn't seem too crazy. Galactus, however, would not just be a cloud monster in this movie. This movie comes out in 2017, after more than a dozen movies in this universe, and they're all mostly been successful. The studio would be far less embarrassed by the comic book roots, so like the X-Men and Wolverine specifically would all wear costumes in every single one of their appearances. The X-Men would wear yellow and blue spandex, not the black that they always wear, and Galactus would still be a big purple man, or a big man in a purple suit, who eats planets, and not a cloud monster. The closest thing that the X-Men universe has to Spider-Man, at least in terms of design, and also the possibility of the amount of movies that Spider-Man will have, is Deadpool. The movie can essentially be the same, to be honest, just without any jokes about the confusing timeline, because there isn't a confusing timeline. It's pretty solid, and maybe a couple other X-Men can appear, but we haven't mentioned Colossus up until this point, so this would technically be Colossus's debut, unless he appears in the Kitty Pryde movie, because those two are a couple in the comics. So then there's the counterpart to Thor Ragnarok, with this counterpart having to be the third Wolverine movie, which in the real world is Logan. It's called Logan because it's based off of Old Man Logan, where Wolverine is old and it takes place in the future, and in the end, spoiler alert, he does die. This would not be Logan, it wouldn't even be called Logan because it doesn't take place in the future, and it isn't based off of Old Man Logan at all. The only similarity it would have to Logan is the fact that it introduces X-23, setting her up to replace Logan as Wolverine down the line. In fact, I think the movie could be called Wolverine X-23, and it does not end with Logan's death. That happens a bit later. So then there's Black Panther, with its counterpart being a Namor movie. Namor wasn't ever owned by Fox, but seeing as the MCU has movies about a character owned by a different company, which is Spider-Man, through a deal that they had with Sony, I allowed myself, or actually I forced myself, to put one franchise in this universe at some point, about a character owned by a different studio, but also would have to be a character that isn't a part of the MCU and isn't owned by Disney. It would have to be a studio that isn't Disney, that owns like maybe one or two characters. I did consider Spider-Man or maybe even the Hulk, but I think Namor fits the best in terms of a counterpart to Black Panther, and also fits the best in terms of this universe, as Namor is a mutant in the comics, and he is going to be a mutant in Black Panther Wakanda Forever, so it fits the best by far. And that brings us to the Infinity War equivalent. There were a few options for who the big bad could be, like Apocalypse or Galactus, but looking at their real-world X-Men movies, they decided on two separate occasions to end a respective series of X-Men movies, the originals and the prequels, by attempting to adapt the Dark Phoenix saga, keyword being attempted, as neither of them were very good. This time around, it would be a lot more epic, it would be a lot bigger, it would threaten the entire world and bring together every single franchise in the XMcu, and it would be a two-parter. Just in general, it would be a lot better. In the end of this movie, the Phoenix Force would kill most of the X-Men and some of the Fantastic Four and other unaffiliated heroes, and leave a ragtag group of heroes to pick up the pieces, leading into the endgame counterpart. One of those heroes is Kitty Pryde, who accesses the alternate universe that allows them to time travel, and one of those heroes is Mr. Fantastic, who builds a machine that harnesses Kitty Pryde's other dimension that they're brought to, and that's where the time travel comes from. What the time travel would try to achieve, we'll get to that in a minute. So Daredevil was the counterpart to Ant-Man, so Ant-Man and the Wasp has to be Daredevil 2. I gotta be honest, this does feel a bit awkward. This is always the most awkward part of the universe restructuring. It's very difficult to justify the movies that come out between Infinity War and Endgame, while also taking place prior to Infinity War. So instead, I think these movies can take place within the gap between Dark Phoenix and the final movie, and we would see the lives of this post-apocalyptic world, or whatever the ending would look like, through the perspective of Matt Murdock, the most street-level hero in this universe. The same would go for The New Mutants, a movie I'm including due to it existing in real life, and also it could have some sort of significance to the Endgame counterpart, with some of the New Mutants being very powerful and possibly turning the tide against the Phoenix in the next movie in the final battle. Speaking of the final battle, that brings us to X-Men The Last Stand, which is the other movie that's based off of the Dark Phoenix saga, and it's actually a pretty good title for an Endgame style movie in this universe. It's the X-Men's Last Stand, and also it's a Dark Phoenix movie. It fits perfectly, despite the fact that it's not very good in the real world. This time around, it would be fantastic. And you already know a lot of the story from what I've mentioned up until this point, but just to go from like top to bottom, Kitty Pryde's time travel powers would be a bit different here. She would have dimensional hopping powers, and Mr. Fantastic would build a time machine harnessing the power from one of those dimensions so that they can go back in time, and the mission here is to kill Jean Grey before she can fully unleash her Phoenix powers so that the Phoenix isn't able to take over any other characters. No other character would be powerful enough. Jean obviously fights back until she reads the time traveler's minds and sees the horrors that she ends up committing, so she does allow Wolverine to kill her in the same exact way that he did in X-Men The Last Stand, which basically acts as one of the big deaths of this movie, the Black Widow counterpart, if you will. The heroes then return to a different timeline, one where the Phoenix Force couldn't find any mutants as powerful as Jean Grey, so it's much weaker. But without a human form, it is a lot weaker, but it does attack the X-Men. It's still very, very powerful, and the X-Men need the help of all the other heroes in this universe to stop them, including the newcomers, the New Mutants. And in the end, both Gambit and Wolverine die to kill the Dark Phoenix, which also sets up X-23 to become the next Wolverine. After this movie comes out, Fox begins branding the entire first 3 phases together as the Dark Phoenix Saga. And the final movie in the saga, the counterpart to Spider-Man Far From Home, is Deadpool 2, which also includes time travel, and we don't really have to change anything about this movie. It could literally be the exact same thing.